On the morning of March 22nd, 1977, a 44-year-old woman named Ruth Morgan rushed around her kitchen in the American city of Tucson, Arizona, like she did almost every day. Ruth was making sure her 4 daughters had everything they needed for school. As she did this, her girls all sat at the kitchen table eating their cereal, and their father, Ruth's husband, 39-year-old Chuck Morgan, sipped his coffee nearby. Ruth wished that Chuck would notice that she could really use some help right now getting the girls' stuff ready, but like he had been more and more recently, Chuck just seemed to be off in his own world. Annoyed, Ruth opened the fridge, took out 2 lunches packed in paper bags, and handed them to her younger daughters, and then she grabbed 2 backpacks that were lying on the floor nearby, and she handed them to her older girls. Then, a few minutes later, all 4 girls were hurrying out the door toward the car, with Ruth and Chuck following after them. As Chuck climbed into the driver's seat of their Mercury Cougar, Ruth, who was standing outside the car and would not be joining them, asked Chuck what time he'd be home from work. Chuck was going to drop the kids off and then go to his office. And for a second, Chuck didn't answer his wife. He just sat there looking totally exhausted. Chuck ran his own escrow company, which meant that his firm set up real estate deals between buyers and sellers to make sure the deals were conducted legally. And Tucson's real estate market was booming, so Chuck had been working a lot recently. Through the open car window, he turned and told Ruth that he was working on a huge deal, so he didn't really know what time he'd be back. Ruth wished Chuck did not have to work so much, but she also knew that nothing she said could stop him. As long as she'd known him, Chuck had been incredibly driven, to the point where sometimes Ruth worried about his health. He never took time off, and on the rare instances where he was not working, he didn't do things to relax, like watching TV or going and seeing his friends. Instead, it just seemed like Chuck bounced from one business deal or crisis to the next. And about once a year, he would push himself so hard with his work that he would basically have a nervous breakdown. At least that's what Ruth called it. And at that point, he would take a week off to recover, but that was it. The rest of the time, he basically worked 24/7. But Ruth also knew that Chuck's insane work ethic and drive was definitely paying off. It had already made their family much more financially successful than they ever imagined possible. Chuck and Ruth had grown up in very modest households, and so now to be able to give their girls a comfortable upbringing was quite satisfying for the parents. And so, on this typical Tuesday morning, Ruth did not push back on the possibility of Chuck needing to work late to finish this big deal. Instead, she just told him he looked great in his brown suit, she gave him a kiss, and watched as he turned on the car, pulled out of the driveway, and headed off in the direction of the girls' school. That afternoon, the girls came home from school on their own power, and Ruth sent them outside to play while she got dinner ready. She set a place at the table for the whole family, including Chuck, but when 6 o'clock rolled around and Chuck was still not home, Ruth and the girls decided to just eat without him. And when Ruth got the girls bathed and into their pajamas and tucked them into their beds, Chuck was still not home. But Ruth was not worried. This really was kind of typical for Chuck. Chuck's real estate clients were mostly rich businessmen who were buying up land all across the state, and they wanted a lot for their money. They were always calling Chuck away for meetings out of town without any warning, and sometimes Chuck would be gone at these meetings for a couple of days at a time without any notice. And at the time, in 1977, there were no cell phones, and most people, including Ruth and her family, didn't have answering machines. And so, when Ruth hadn't seen Chuck or heard from him, she just figured he must have tried calling the house earlier to let her know that he would indeed be out super late on this deal, but she just must have missed the call because she was out running errands, and so Chuck would just get back whenever he got back. So that night, Ruth went to bed alone, figuring that she would wake up and see Chuck in the morning, or at a minimum, she would get a call the next day from Chuck to figure out where he was, what he was doing, and when to expect him home. But the next day, Chuck did not come home, and he didn't call. And it was the same story the next day. But again, Ruth had seen this behavior from Chuck before. It was rare, but Chuck did sometimes just kind of vanish for days at a stretch on certain deals. And so, at 2 a.m. on March 25th, 3 days after Ruth last saw Chuck or heard from Chuck, it was when he drove off to drop the girls at school, Ruth lay awake in her and Chuck's upstairs bedroom, trying to now convince herself that Chuck was fine, that everything was okay, that this was totally normal. But she now knew that this was officially the longest stretch of time she had ever gone without hearing from Chuck. And deep down, she started to feel like something had to be wrong. But as she lay there stressing out about all sorts of what-if scenarios, she heard the family dog barking downstairs, and instantly, Ruth let out a sigh of relief. The dog must be barking because Chuck was walking in the door. He was home. So Ruth climbed out of bed, she walked into the hallway, flipped on the light, and began heading downstairs. And as she descended the steps, she called out to Chuck, but no one answered. When she got to the first floor, there was still no answer, and the dog was now starting to bark even louder. And suddenly the hairs on Ruth's arms stood up. If Chuck wasn't home, why was the dog barking? What was going on? She dashed across the living room into the kitchen, she turned on the light, and saw the family dog up on its hind legs, pawing at the back door and barking. Ruth very slowly crept toward that door and pulled back the curtain that covered a small window on it, and she looked outside. And what she saw took her breath away. It was Chuck. However, he was just standing there on the back step, not making any attempt to come in the house. And he had this crazed look on his face. And when he saw Ruth, he didn't react. He just stood there staring. Ruth had no idea what her husband was doing. She was just relieved that he was home. And so she reached down and fumbled with the lock. She opened the door and frantically told Chuck to come in and tell her what was going on. Where had he been? But once the door was open, Chuck kind of just staggered into the kitchen and literally fell into Ruth's arms. She dragged him across the room and put him in one of the kitchen chairs, and then once he was seated, Ruth finally got a good look at her husband and she nearly screamed. Chuck's eyes were totally bloodshot, like he hadn't slept in days, and his wrists were bound with zip ties, and he had a plastic handcuff on one of his ankles. But what scared Ruth most of all was that Chuck still was just not speaking. She asked him again to tell her what was going on, but he just sat there silent, looking off into the distance. Ruth ran to a kitchen drawer and grabbed a knife, and then she rushed to Chuck and cut the ties around his wrists, and when Chuck's hands were free, he finally began to communicate with Ruth, but not with words, instead with hand gestures. He motioned towards a notepad and pen sitting on the counter nearby, and so Ruth, understanding what he was asking for, reached over and grabbed the pen and paper and handed them to Chuck. And as he wrote, Ruth, who was now kind of hovering over his shoulder, couldn't believe the words on the paper. When Chuck was done, Ruth ran to the phone and said they had to call 911 right now. But at this, Chuck banged on the table and shook his head at her to stop. Then, in huge letters on the pad, he told Ruth that if they called the cops, their whole family would be killed. Ruth moved away from the phone and started crying. Chuck began to stand up, and Ruth instinctively grabbed him and supported him on her shoulder, and then just walked him upstairs to their bedroom, where he lay down and fell asleep almost instantly. And after he was asleep, Ruth, not knowing what else to do, just did a quick check of the girls and was very relieved to see that none of them had woken up to the commotion of their father returning. Then Ruth headed back to her own bedroom and laid down next to Chuck, but she didn't shut her eyes. Instead, she lay awake trying to figure out what the heck just happened and what she was going to do about it. On the notepad, Chuck had written that he'd been kidnapped and tortured for 2 days before managing to escape, and that now his throat was coated with a hallucinogenic drug that made it impossible for him to talk and could maybe even kill him if he ingested it. It should be noted here that we don't really know if he meant the drug was painted inside of his throat or if it was painted on the outside of his neck. We just don't know. The whole thing just seemed totally insane, and so Ruth, as she lay there, started to wonder if maybe this was one of Chuck's annual nervous breakdowns from overworking. But if it was, then this was the most bizarre and extreme breakdown she had ever seen. It took almost a week for Chuck to recover from whatever had happened to him, and during that time, he only communicated with Ruth via notes on a notepad. Again, he was convinced there was a drug painted either on or in his throat that he had to avoid ingesting, and so not talking was his solution. At the beginning of this recovery week, Ruth asked Chuck lots of questions about where he had been and what had happened, but again, she got virtually no answers from him. And so pretty early on in that week, Ruth just began focusing on nursing her husband back to health, which included giving him water through an eyedropper because he had written that if he drank too much liquid at one time, this hallucinogenic drug coating his throat might activate and attack his nervous system. Finally, after that week of recovery was up and Chuck got out of bed and started talking again, Ruth now demanded answers about this whole crazy situation. But nothing Chuck said to her made any sense. Chuck told Ruth that owning his escrow business was not his only job. In addition to his escrow business, he was actually an undercover agent for the U.S. Treasury Department. The Treasury Department is a federal agency that investigates financial crimes. Chuck didn't say who had kidnapped him, but he said they knew he had information that could send them to prison for a long time. As Ruth listened to what her husband was saying, she simply didn't believe him. Instead, she thought this really had to be one of his big annual nervous breakdowns, and that eventually he would just snap out of this and be normal Chuck again. And so, when Chuck insisted that Ruth not tell anyone what he had told her about his real identity and the trouble he had now gotten into, Ruth didn't really care and said, "Fine, I won't tell anyone." But over the next couple of months, Chuck did not snap out of it. He did not become normal Chuck. Instead, his mental state seemed to get worse and worse. He started wearing a bulletproof vest and carrying a .357 Magnum revolver, which is a very powerful pistol, whenever he left the house. He also bought a special belt that could conceal a knife in the buckle, and he grew a big thick beard to disguise his face. He was also convinced that someone had bugged their home phone, so he started to leave the house and go to payphones whenever he had to make calls. And whenever Ruth, who was now becoming very seriously concerned for her husband, asked him what was going on or what he was so scared of, he would just tell her the less she knew, the safer she'd be. On the morning of June 7th, so about 2.5 months after Chuck had stumbled in their back door insisting he had been kidnapped and drugged, Ruth wound up driving the girls to school that morning. When she left, Chuck told her he would be going to his office that day. After Ruth left, Chuck headed to a payphone near their house and called his staff, informing them that he would be there in about a half an hour. But he never showed up, and eventually someone from his staff called the police. Even though Ruth had done what her husband had asked and had not gone to police or told anyone about his strange behavior, she couldn't help but feel incredibly relieved when she heard that the Tucson police had put out a missing person alert for Chuck. However, when the police spoke to her, she opted to continue keeping Chuck's secret, mostly because she was worried if she told them what he told her, they would think he was crazy or dangerous. And so all she told police was that she was just very worried about him and hoped he would come home soon. 9 days later, on the night of June 16th, Chuck had still not been found, he was still missing, no one knew where he was, and this night, Ruth was home, she was sitting on the couch, staring at the television, but she wasn't really watching it. Her mind was wondering where the heck her husband was, and she couldn't help but think that something terrible had happened to him. And as she sat there staring blankly at the TV, the phone rang in the kitchen. And suddenly, Ruth felt a jolt of energy, thinking maybe it was Chuck. And so she ran to the kitchen, she answered the phone, but instead of hearing her husband's voice, she heard a woman's voice that she didn't recognize, and in a quiet voice, the strange woman said, "Ruthie, Chuck is all right. Ecclesiastes 12, 1-8. Then the woman hung up. Ruth just stood there for a second, holding the phone to her ear, listening to the dial tone. Now she was even more confused. Was this some sign that Chuck really was an undercover agent for the Treasury Department, and this woman maybe worked with him there, and maybe she was like his handler, and maybe she was now reaching out to Ruth with some code? I mean, Ruth had no idea, but at least now, Ruth had a clue about what happened to her husband. She had this Bible passage, Ecclesiastes 12, 1-8. So Ruth hung up the phone and ran to a bookshelf in the living room. She stretched up to reach the top shelf and she grabbed her family Bible, and then Ruth rushed with the Bible to the couch. She sat down and flipped through the pages until she got to the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. Ruth read the verses, but she didn't understand what they could possibly have to do with Chuck. They read in part, quote, "Men are afraid of a high place and of terrors on the road. Remember him before the silver cord is severed and the golden bowl is broken." End quote. Ruth eventually just slammed the Bible closed because she had no idea what it meant, and frankly, she had no idea what to think about anything anymore. And at this point, all she hoped for was that her husband was somehow still alive somewhere in the world, and that hopefully he would return soon. About 24 hours later, on June 17th, Chuck, who was actually only a few miles away from his home, sped through Tucson in his Mercury Cougar, constantly checking his rearview mirror to make sure no one was following him. Then he suddenly turned into the parking lot of a cheap motel where he had been hiding out for the last few days, and he came to a stop. Chuck was wearing his bulletproof vest over a sweat-stained dress shirt, and he was also now missing a tooth. Chuck grabbed his briefcase from the passenger seat, and he unholstered his .357 Magnum. Then he climbed out of his car, slammed the door, and sprinted with the briefcase and gun in hand toward the motel. Once safely inside his room, Chuck locked the door and placed the gun as well as the briefcase down on the bed. And then he opened the briefcase, and what he saw made him smile. He was looking at $60,000 in cash stacked neatly inside. For reference, $60,000 then would be worth about $300,000 in today's dollars. Chuck had put this money in the briefcase himself, but he was paranoid that somehow it would just disappear, and so looking at it calmed him down. Then Chuck closed the briefcase and pulled a black marker along with a $2 bill out of his pocket. $2 bills are the rarest form of cash produced in the United States. Then he placed that $2 bill on the bedside table and started writing on it with the marker. After he was done, he pulled his pants down and pinned the now marked up $2 bill to his underwear. Then he pulled his pants back up, he grabbed his gun, he grabbed the briefcase, and then he turned around and rushed right back outside to his car. Once he got there, he threw the briefcase into the passenger seat and then jumped into the driver's seat where he turned the ignition and peeled out of the parking lot. He sped west for a while and eventually pulled onto a dark desert road. After getting about 30 miles outside of Tucson, he swerved off the road into a secluded desert clearing where he stopped the car and cut the ignition. At this point, Chuck reached into his pocket and took out a wadded-up tissue, and he unwrapped it. Inside was the tooth he was missing. He stared at it for a second before balling it back up and then placing it in the back seat of his car. Then he checked to make sure his gun was still in his holster, and it was, and then after taking a deep breath, he grabbed the briefcase from the passenger seat and stepped outside of his car into the desert. The next day, June 18th, Ruth was in her living room when there was a knock at the front door. When Ruth opened it, an officer from the Pima County Sheriff's Department was standing there. For a second, Ruth felt a flood of relief. Maybe they were here to say they found Chuck and that he was okay. But moments later, when she was sitting on her couch in the living room, the officer told her that he had some bad news. Two people driving down a highway in the desert to the west of the city had just discovered Chuck's body. The officer told Ruth that Chuck was lying out in the sand and appeared to have committed suicide. The officer suggested that perhaps Chuck had had some sort of mental breakdown, as his appearance was totally bizarre. He was missing a tooth that looked like it had recently been knocked out or pulled out. He was armed with this powerful firearm, and in his pocket was a $2 bill with incomprehensible messages written all over it. Ruth was absolutely devastated, even though she wasn't really shocked at the news. After a moment, when she had composed herself, she asked the officer if any of the messages on the $2 bill might be like a suicide note for her and the kids, explaining what had happened. And the officer just shook his head and said, no, there was no communication left behind besides on this $2 bill, and that was definitely not intended for you. After hearing this, Ruth finally just broke down and sobbed. She felt a horrible sense of guilt and regret about how she had handled Chuck's behavior over the last few months. She wished she had just totally ignored his request and gone to the police right away, or at least told someone about what was going on with him, because maybe then he'd be alive. But underneath her own feelings of guilt, Ruth also started to feel kind of angry with Chuck. Why hadn't he left behind some sort of note for her or the kids? Why would he take his life without at least explaining the situation to his own family who he loved? It made no sense. In the aftermath of Chuck's death, Ruth planned his funeral and focused all of her energy on making sure her girls were okay. She didn't want to believe that Chuck had killed himself, but the police department was adamant that that was what happened. And in time, Ruth and her kids began to accept that that was the reality. Fast forward to sometime in the late 1980s, roughly a decade after Chuck had died, and Ruth was home in the same house she had shared with Chuck when her phone rang. And when she heard what the man on the other end of the line had to say, her heart suddenly started to beat rapidly and she had to grab a chair to sit down. The caller's name was Don Devereaux, and he was an investigative reporter. And he told Ruth that he wanted to meet with her because he had something very important to tell her. Something he said she might not believe. It was about her late husband, Chuck. When the pair met at a local coffee shop, Dawn asked Ruth if she was really ready to hear everything, even if it was painful. And Ruth, even though her voice trembled, didn't hesitate. She said, "Yes, tell me." Based on Dawn's independent investigation following Chuck's death, this is a reconstruction of what Dawn believes could have happened on the night of June 17, 1977, the night that police said Chuck committed suicide. According to Dawn's theory, on the night of June 17th, Chuck drove out into the desert, he parked, he stepped out of his car carrying that briefcase that contained $60,000 in cash, he had his .357 Magnum pistol on his hip, and more guns in the car, and as he's standing out there, he sees up ahead headlights suddenly appear a few yards away from where Chuck was standing, and once that car came to a stop, a man stepped out who was wearing a dark suit. Chuck took a step towards this man, but the man quickly pulled out a gun and aimed it at Chuck, and so Chuck froze. The man told him to show him the cash, at which point Chuck did open up the briefcase. The man told Chuck to put the briefcase on the ground and turn around, and so Chuck followed the instructions, believing that in just a few minutes, the nightmare he had been living through would finally be over, and he would be able to drive back home to Ruth and his girls, and then they could move far away and put all of this behind them forever. After turning away from the man in the suit, Chuck stood there listening to the sound of this man walking closer and closer to him. And then this man's footsteps stopped right behind him, and suddenly Chuck would have felt a jerk by his hip, and he would have realized the man in the suit had grabbed Chuck's gun from its holster. And then before Chuck could do anything, this man had fired Chuck's gun into the back of Chuck's head, killing him instantly. Then the man in the suit wiped the gun of his fingerprints and positioned it near Chuck's hand to make it look like Chuck had shot himself. Then the man in the suit grabbed the briefcase, walked back to his car, and drove away, leaving Chuck's body where he fell. Dawn wasn't sure if Chuck actually worked undercover for the U.S. Treasury Department, but Dawn did think that Chuck had somehow gotten involved with organized crime, most likely through his escrow business. Dawn believed that Chuck had been conducting illegal real estate deals that allowed criminals to smuggle drugs into Arizona from Mexico, and then Chuck was then laundering their drug money for them. Money laundering is concealing money gained illegally by transferring it through international banks into legitimate businesses like real estate. Dawn knew that weeks before Chuck's supposed kidnapping, the state of Arizona and the Arizona Attorney General's office had named Chuck as a witness in a trial that involved an organized crime boss. Dawn believed that that crime boss had hired a hitman to kill Chuck to keep him from testifying against him. And most likely, according to Dawn, Chuck had figured this out. And so that was why Chuck had begun carrying a weapon around and wearing a bulletproof vest all the time. But Dawn said he had learned from a friend of Chuck's, a woman known simply as, quote, Green Eyes, that the hitman had told Chuck he would call off the hit if Chuck just paid him, the hitman, $60,000 in cash. So Dawn believes that Chuck jumped at this opportunity to save himself, and it was likely the reason he left his house on June 7th, 1977, to go get the money and pay off the hitman. However, the meeting with the hitman didn't happen until June 17th, 10 days later. And obviously the hitman did not keep his promise. The hitman was very likely the man in the suit, and he just took the money from Chuck and killed him anyways. And so as for what Chuck was doing and why he was avoiding his wife and kids and the police during those 10 days between when he left his house on June 7th and disappeared and when he was killed on June 17th, Dawn, and everybody else for that matter, has no idea. And that was far from the only unanswered question in this case. The friend of Chuck's, known as Green Eyes, admitted to being the woman who called Ruth on June 16th, the night before Chuck died, to mention that Bible verse from Ecclesiastes. However, she never specified what it meant. Dawn believed that the Bible verse could be a code that Chuck had asked Green Eyes to pass along to Ruth and his family, maybe to signify that he was okay. But if the Bible verse was really a code, why hadn't Chuck given Ruth a way to crack it? Because she had no idea what it meant. Again, Dawn doesn't know, and really no one knows why. As for the tooth that was found in the back seat of Chuck's car out in the desert, Dawn said that had a very specific meaning. At the time Chuck died, there were rumors that some mobsters removed their victims' teeth to keep them from being identified by police after they were killed. So Dawn believed that maybe Chuck removed one of his teeth in advance of his meeting with this hitman and then left the tooth in his car to ensure officials would be able to still identify him if the worst were to happen during this meeting. As for the $2 bill that was found with the strange messages written all over it, Dawn said these messages were not nonsense at all. They were Chuck's attempt to tell the world what had happened to him. Dawn had not completely solved the riddle, but he believed he was close. On the front of the $2 bill, Chuck had written 7 Spanish last names. On the back, where the $2 bill shows a picture of the founding fathers who had signed the Declaration of Independence, Chuck had labeled each of the men in the picture with the numbers 1 through 7. He had also scrawled a crude map of a route from Tucson to the Mexican border. Dawn told Ruth that he believed the names and the map were Chuck's way of pointing to specific smugglers moving drugs between Mexico and Tucson. There was one last clue on the $2 bill. It was the phrase Ecclesiastes 12. This was the same section of the Bible that Green Eyes had mentioned to Ruth on the phone on June 16th. And so it supported the theory that the Bible verse could be some kind of code, but of course that code is still not cracked. After Dawn finished telling Ruth his theory about Chuck, Ruth felt a sense of relief that maybe finally she had gotten the explanation she had so desperately wanted for all these years. But at the same time, it was clear that Dawn's theory was just that, a theory. And there are many more compelling theories about Chuck, some that include him actually being an undercover agent for the government, others that paint him as a man who simply lost his mind. But as of today, all we know for sure is that Chuck was found shot to death out in the desert, and officially, his death is still listed as a suicide. On August 6, 2016, Sebastian De Leon was slumped in the backseat of a car heading to Orlando, Florida for a short vacation with his parents, Raphael and Brunilda. The drive from their home in Weston, Florida was only about 3 hours. But to 16-year-old Sebastian, the trip felt much longer. He had a lingering headache and his eyes felt itchy and sensitive. He drank some water, rubbed his temples, and focused on the soft rumbling of the car. Sebastian wondered if his headache might be from getting too much sun the day before, since he'd spent the whole day swimming with friends in a lake. But Sebastian worked most of the summer as a camp counselor, so he was outside all the time in the sun, and it never really seemed to bother him, so it didn't make sense to him why yesterday would be any different. Whatever the reason, Sebastian was just totally annoyed at feeling so out of it. He'd been looking forward to this trip to Orlando for weeks. Tomorrow, they had tickets to his favorite amusement park, and tonight they were staying at a nice hotel nearby. It seemed like the perfect dose of late summer fun before school started next month, but Sebastian was worried that he might not feel well enough to even enjoy it. Sebastian groaned, made a pillow out of his duffel bag, and tried to rest. Maybe by the time they got there, the worst of this would be over. But a couple hours later, Sebastian's head was still pounding as his father parked in front of their hotel. Sebastian's parents unloaded the car, and then they all headed up to their room. Sebastian's parents, Raphael and Brunilda, unpacked and got dressed for dinner, but Sebastian felt too dizzy to even think about food. So he crawled into bed and told his parents to go eat without him. He wasn't hungry. Sebastian curled up in the bed, put his blanket over his head, and hoped a good night's sleep would set him straight. But the next morning, Sebastian's head hurt even worse. And now his eyes were starting to ache as well. Even the soft glow of sunlight through the hotel window felt blinding. Sebastian asked his mom to please shut the blinds, but she told him they were closed. Plus, it was cloudy outside. Brunilda sat next to him on the bed and put her hand on his forehead to check if he was feverish. Sebastian winced in pain when she touched him. His skin felt prickly and hypersensitive. Even the bedsheet against his body was very uncomfortable. Sebastian tried to sit up and get out of bed, but the covers suddenly felt too heavy for him to even move. Sebastian felt confused and overwhelmed. He'd never felt so weak and uncomfortable before. It even felt hard to form clear thoughts. He heard his mom making a phone call, then his dad came in and sat beside him. Raphael told Sebastian they were going to take him to a nearby hospital. They had decided that his condition seemed too serious to wait until they got home to deal with. Sebastian's dad helped him get out of bed and get dressed. When his parents opened the hotel room door, Sebastian moaned in pain from the light and turned away. Even with his eyes closed, the light felt almost unbearable. His dad pulled a pair of sunglasses from his shirt pocket and put them on Sebastian's eyes. Then he helped him walk unsteadily down the hallway towards the parking lot. The family reached their car, and Sebastian crawled into the back seat. He heard his parents whispering to each other as they drove away from the hotel. Then Sebastian slipped into a haze. That afternoon, a lab coordinator at the Florida Hospital for Children, named Sheila Black, was drinking coffee between tasks when she heard a knock at her door. It was an assistant nurse with a sample of spinal fluid and Sebastian's patient file. Doctors suspected the young man had meningitis, which is an inflammation of the spinal cord caused by a bacterial or viral infection. One of its most revealing symptoms is sensitivity to light. To test for this disease, Sheila needed to examine the sample of Sebastian's spinal fluid. Sheila thanked the nurse, took the sample to a microscope, and squeezed a dropper of the fluid onto a slide. Then she slid the slide beneath the lens and adjusted the focus. The first thing she saw was that Sebastian's spinal fluid was clear, not cloudy. Spinal fluid is usually clear, but it turns cloudy when it's infected by meningitis. Sheila made a note on the spinal fluid container that Sebastian tested negative for meningitis, but decided to keep studying his sample under the microscope a little bit longer. Overall, the sample looked the way it was supposed to. It was clear, colorless, and scattered with little white blood cells. And so Sheila really had no idea what could be making Sebastian so sick. She scanned through Sebastian's files looking for clues. She noted his age, but then read further to where it mentioned Sebastian had gone swimming in a lake the day before his symptoms started. Going swimming in a lake was not unusual for a Florida teenager, but Sheila had recently attended a seminar about a rare type of microorganism that lives in warm freshwater lakes. When that microorganism enters the human body, it could cause an infection that seems like meningitis, but it's actually much worse. An 11-year-old boy died from this microorganism infection at her hospital only 2 years before, and so Sheila had never forgotten how heartbreaking it felt to be so powerless as that young child slipped away. Sheila hoped her hunch was wrong, but there was only one way to find out. Sheila took another sip of coffee and then leaned in and peered into the microscope again. She stared at Sebastian's spinal fluid sample for a long time, looking for one telltale sign. She couldn't allow a repeat of what happened last time. Then, suddenly, Sheila saw a flicker of movement in the sample. She blinked and looked closer. It happened again. A tiny bulge on one of the white blood cells wiggled. maybe these were not actually white blood cells. They were something else, something alive. Maybe they were the very organism she was afraid that Sebastian could have been infected by. Sheila called Sebastian's doctor and told him what she'd just found. If this was what she thought it was, unfortunately, Sebastian was facing a death sentence. Sebastian's doctor, Humberto Liriano, slowly lowered the phone from his ear to his side and leaned his head against the wall. He felt crushed by Sheila's news. As a pediatrician who had treated some of the sickest kids, Dr. Liriano always tried to stay optimistic, even in the darkest times. But sometimes it was hard not to feel totally defeated. If Sheila's finding was accurate, Sebastian did not have much of a chance. Dr. Liriano had treated this same infection 4 other times, and in all 4 cases, none of the patients survived. Still, he felt a deep sense of duty to never give up. No matter how unlikely Sebastian's chance of survival was, Dr. Liriano resolved to fight with everything he had. He made some calls to get a team in place, and then he had Sebastian moved to a room in the critical care unit, and then he went to study Sheila's lab results more closely. And right away, Dr. Liriano could tell from looking at Sebastian's spinal fluid that Sheila's fears were right. This was the worst-case scenario. But there was one ray of hope. Dr. Liriano had heard of a new medication designed to combat Sebastian's condition with this microorganism. It was named Impavido, Spanish for undaunted. But there was a catch. The drug was still undergoing safety review. The makers of Impavido were still negotiating with the Food and Drug Administration for approval to get wider distribution, so very few hospitals were able to stock it, including the Florida Hospital for Children. Dr. Liriano called the hospital's pharmacy. He told them he had a patient who urgently needed Impavido and to call everywhere until they found some. The pharmacist said they would and hung up. Dr. Liriano paced in his office, trying to think of how else he might be able to save Sebastian in case he couldn't get this medication in time. He knew of other patients who had died waiting for it to arrive. Just then, Dr. Liriano's phone rang. It was the hospital's pharmacy. They'd gotten in touch with the Centers for Disease Control, who had already tracked down the CEO of Impavido's manufacturer, which was based right in Orlando. And they apparently said that they had Impavido available and would be happy to supply the hospital with as much as they needed. Dr. Liriano felt a rush of joy at this news until the pharmacist finished their sentence. There was one problem. Impavido was stored in a safe at the CEO's office, and the CEO was out of town. Dr. Liriano groaned in frustration. He asked how long it would be until the CEO could make it back to the office. If the medicine didn't make it to the hospital soon, it would be too late to save Sebastian. The pharmacist said the CEO was away in Boston, Massachusetts through the weekend. There was basically no way he could make it back in time. But there was one other person who had access to the safe, the CEO's son, Michael. Not only that, but Michael was already on his way to get the Impavido for Sebastian. He would then personally rush it to the Florida Hospital for Children. Dr. Liriano was ecstatic to hear this, but none of it would matter if it took too long to deliver the drug, and so he asked where this office was to gauge how long Sebastian would have to wait. And the pharmacist's answer that the company's offices were only about 10 miles from the hospital nearly brought tears of joy to the doctor's eyes. After he hung up with the pharmacist, Dr. Liriano ran to the ER. When he got there, he assigned a nurse to wait by the entrance for the CEO's son, Michael, and the second he got there, this nurse was supposed to take the drug from him and rush it up to the critical care unit where Sebastian was. But there was still one other task that Dr. Liriano had to complete before they could institute this drug, and that was telling Sebastian's parents what was going on with Sebastian. Dr. Liriano steadied himself and then went down the hall to Sebastian's room. He peeked in at the doorway and saw Sebastian lying in bed, barely conscious. His parents, Brunilda and Raphael, sat on opposite sides of the bed, looking totally exhausted and terrified. Dr. Liriano stepped inside and then asked Sebastian's parents to please follow him out into the hall. Dr. Liriano could see in the parents' faces how much they were dreading whatever he was about to tell them. Once they were out in the hall, Dr. Liriano explained Sebastian's situation as clearly as he could. He said their son had caught an infection caused by a microorganism while he was swimming, and now this infection had spread deep into his body and his life was in danger. When he said this, the parents' faces went white. They stared at Dr. Liriano blankly. He told them the good news was that a new medication was on the way to the hospital this very second. The bad news was that Dr. Liriano had never been able to use this medication before, so he didn't know for sure if it would even work. Still, it was the best and potentially only chance they had against an infection with a very low survival rate. Only 3% of people who get this infection survive. Dr. Liriano gave the parents a few minutes to absorb this terrible news. Then he explained that in order to use this new medicine, they would have to put Sebastian into a medically induced coma, taking him to the brink of death in order to save his life. So if they wanted to say anything to Sebastian, now was the time. There might not be a later. Brunilda and Raphael nodded and went back into their son's room. They stood on either side of his bed and held his hands. His mother, Brunilda, cried as she told him what a perfect boy he was, and that he was going to be just fine, medicine was on the way that would help him, and God was looking out for him. Sebastian's father, Raphael, made the sign of the cross and squeezed his son's hand. Then he leaned close to his face and told his son how strong he was, how he would beat this, and how they would all live a long, happy life together. Dr. Liriano was very moved by the parents and what they were saying to their son, but at some point he stepped in and asked Brunilda and Raphael to please leave the room, and then he had his nurses prep Sebastian for the medically induced coma, which required them to drastically lower Sebastian's body temperature. The team jumped into action, prepping IVs and hooking Sebastian up to various monitors. Dr. Liriano made sure everything looked good and headed out to the reception desk to wait for the impavido. The whole floor was tense with anticipation. Then the elevator at the end of the hall dinged. Dr. Liriano heard rapid footsteps, and suddenly a nurse sprinted around the corner holding a package. It was the impavido that Michael had brought. Dr. Liriano looked at his watch. He had called the pharmacy less than half an hour ago. Sebastian still had a chance. He ran back to Sebastian's room and quickly opened the container holding the impavido pills. Once Sebastian had taken them, an anesthesiologist sedated him. Within moments, Sebastian was asleep. A nurse gave him an IV drip of cold saltwater solution, while another wrapped him in frozen blankets. Dr. Liriano paced while keeping his eyes glued to Sebastian's monitor. This process would give the medication more time to work, but it was always very dangerous to cool a body so rapidly. Sometimes organs reacted very unpredictably. Within the hour, Sebastian's body temperature was down to 91 degrees Fahrenheit, and Sebastian was officially comatose. Once Sebastian's breathing began to slow, Dr. Liriano gently fed a tube down his throat to help his body maintain a steady flow of oxygen. So far, the procedure had gone exactly as planned. All they could do now was wait and hope. The next morning, Dr. Liriano had some more of Sebastian's spinal fluid drawn to assess how the impavido was doing. He took the fluid down to the lab and studied it under a microscope, and when he looked, he let out a sigh of relief. There were already far fewer tiny wriggling creatures in the sample. The infection had significantly reduced. By the following morning, Dr. Liriano was beginning to believe that Sebastian was actually going to make it. He found Sebastian's parents half asleep on a bench in the waiting room. They jolted awake when he spoke to them. Dr. Liriano told them he didn't want to celebrate too early, but so far, all signs were very positive. When the parents heard this, they cheered and hugged the doctor tightly. But Dr. Liriano made it clear that Sebastian was not out of the woods yet. They still would have to bring him out of the medically induced coma. Dr. Liriano's team began steadily warming Sebastian's body. Minute by minute, his temperature rose until finally he was back at the normal 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Dr. Liriano then removed Sebastian's breathing tube and then hovered at his bedside, waiting. Then it happened. Sebastian took a big gulp of air on his own, and his heartbeat remained steady. Sebastian was out of his coma. A little while later, Sebastian's eyes blinked open. He gazed around the room like he'd just woken up from a deep sleep. Dr. Liriano immediately sent a nurse to go get his parents. Brunilda and Raphael rushed inside and threw themselves on their son. Everyone in the room clapped, cheered, and hugged. Dr. Liriano was ecstatic, but also stunned. This wasn't just a miracle, it made history. What Sheila Black found in Sebastian's spinal fluid should have killed him. It's a rare organism called Naegleria fowleri that lives in warm, stagnant waters, exactly like the lake where Sebastian had been swimming. When infected water goes up a swimmer's nose, the microorganism then travels through the body to the brain. Once there, it attacks tissue, basically eating the victim's brain. This causes swelling that eventually shuts the brain down and the victim dies. That's why this organism is commonly known as the brain-eating amoeba. But what confirmed Sheila's hunch that this was a brain-eating amoeba was the organism's particular way of moving. It uses microscopic appendages to row itself like oars on a boat. That's why the microorganisms looked like they were wiggling under the microscope. In 57 years of documented brain-eating amoeba infections, Sebastian had become just the 4th person in the United States to survive after being attacked by them. Dr. Liriano told Sebastian's parents that their son had been both horribly unlucky, but also at the same time extremely lucky. Because if the medicine that ultimately saved his life had been stored basically anywhere else, he probably would not have gotten it in time. Of all the places in the world the medicine manufacturer's headquarters could be, they were also in Orlando, just a few miles from the hospital where Sebastian was. All told, it took less than 20 minutes for the CEO's son to rush and get the medicine and deliver it to the hospital. A few hours after coming out of his medically induced coma, Sebastian was able to speak again. It took 2 years for him to regain all his motor skills, but eventually he made a full recovery. And now for our second story, called Burning from the Inside. On a Sunday night, just after Christmas in 2015, 27-year-old Kayla Hansen weaved through the crowded dining room of Grimaldi's, a popular Italian restaurant in Peoria, Arizona. The restaurant was unusually busy that night. As the manager, it was up to Kayla to keep things organized. So she was doing a little bit of everything, helping out the waitstaff, checking on customers, and generally just making sure everything was running smoothly. For someone less experienced, this whole night might have been totally overwhelming. But Kayla was a veteran and workaholic who regularly put in 60 or 70-hour weeks. She was totally in her element. Closing time was fast approaching, so Kayla grabbed an order of pasta and raced out of the kitchen. As she crossed through the doorway, though, she let her guard down for a second and collided with one of her servers. The tray Kayla was carrying fell to the floor, and Kayla staggered back into the doorframe, and she grabbed the doorframe to steady herself, but before she could get her balance, the door swung back and smashed into her hand. Kayla cried out in pain and yanked her hand back. The server apologized and ran to get some ice, but Kayla waved her away. She wasn't bleeding, and she figured she just didn't have time to ice a minor injury like this. Kayla's hand was in a lot of pain, and she could feel it aching right away, but she shrugged it off and helped the waiter clean up the food that had spilled. Then Kayla finished up her shift and headed home, ready to get some sleep. The next morning, Kayla woke up and felt a throbbing pain in her right hand. She looked down and saw that it was totally swollen and the skin was bright red and tender. It didn't look good. Kayla groaned in frustration. She was supposed to meet her friends for a hike later, but as much as she wanted to ignore the pain in her hand, she knew she really needed to change her plans and go get her hand checked out by a doctor. So she texted her friends and said she would not be able to go on the hike that day, and then she called her primary care doctor and got an appointment for later that day. By the time Kayla got to the doctor's office that afternoon, her hand was really hurting. But when the doctor examined her hand, he told Kayla she had just bruised the soft tissue. Her hand wasn't broken, so the swelling would eventually go down and she'd be fine. Kayla was totally relieved to hear this. It would have been extremely difficult to work at the restaurant with a broken hand. So Kayla figured she'd get better in a couple of days and really just kind of stopped thinking about her hand. It still hurt, but it didn't feel like an urgent matter. 2 weeks later, Kayla was in her bathroom getting ready for the day, trying to brush her hair with her uninjured left hand. Her right hand, the damaged hand, was still swollen and tender, even though it had now been 2 weeks since she hurt it. The swelling really had not gone down at all, and the pain seemed to be getting worse every day. In fact, the pain had gotten so bad on several days over these past 2 weeks that she'd had to call into work sick. Kayla could not afford to keep taking time off of work, so she was starting to feel really worried about her hand again. Kayla fumbled the brush and shook her head in frustration. Then, just kind of out of instinct, she picked the brush back up with her damaged hand, and as soon as she grabbed it, it felt like an electric shock ran up her right arm. Kayla immediately dropped the brush and then grabbed her injured hand. She could feel the skin was incredibly hot to the touch, and it almost felt like it was on fire from the inside out. It was so painful. And now, also, her right arm hurt too, and it was beginning to swell just like her hand. Kayla realized she just couldn't push through this pain any longer. It was horrible, and so she decided she would go back to her doctor. Later that day, Kayla was in her doctor's office as the doctor was examining her swollen right arm. It took Kayla everything she could not to scream out in pain every time the doctor very gently pressed her hand or arm. After the doctor finished his exam, he told Kayla that this was clearly more than just a bad bruise to her hand. But it was not clear to the doctor why Kayla was in this much pain. Her tests and x-rays showed nothing was wrong with her. The doctor thought maybe it was something nerve-related, so he referred Kayla to a pain specialist named Dr. Nicholas Scott, whose focus was on identifying and managing chronic pain conditions. Kayla very carefully cradled her right arm as she thanked the doctor, and then she got up to leave. She hoped Dr. Scott would be able to help her, because she really didn't know how much more pain she could bear. A couple of weeks later, Kayla arrived at the Arizona Pain Clinic for her appointment with Dr. Scott. She hoped he would have an answer for her so she could get better and finally go back to her old life. Not only was she missing work all the time, but Kayla was also in too much pain to go hiking or fishing, or really do much of anything that she used to do for fun. Kayla waited in the exam room for a short period of time before Dr. Scott entered. His calm demeanor put her at ease, but she couldn't help but flinch when he examined her hand, which was still swollen and still had these bright red blotches all over it. Once he was done, Dr. Scott asked Kayla if she knew what might have caused the injury. She told him about her busy night at the restaurant at the end of December and how her hand had gotten smashed in a door, but she didn't see how such a minor injury could cause this much pain and swelling and over such a long period of time. Dr. Scott nodded and told Kayla he could not find any tissue damage or broken bones, just like her other doctor. However, he believed she had developed a rare condition called complex regional pain syndrome, or CRPS, that can develop after there's been nerve damage. He explained that a nerve in Kayla's injured hand was misfiring and sending signals to the brain that she was in extreme pain, even though the original hand injury was not that bad. Dr. Scott told Kayla that there was no cure for CRPS, but they could find a way to manage the pain and the burning sensation until it went into remission. Now, it usually went into remission after only a few months, but unfortunately for some, as the doctor explained, it could take a few years. Dr. Scott said they had no way of knowing which group Kayla would fall into. Kayla was relieved that Dr. Scott had a diagnosis, but the possibility of living with such excruciating pain for years on end was terrifying. She just hoped that the doctors and her medical team could somehow get this pain under control and get her back to normal life soon. About 9 months later, on December 16, 2016, Kayla was in her kitchen struggling to cook some dinner. None of the pain treatments that Dr. Scott tried had worked. Over the past few months, the horrible burning pain in her right hand and arm had spread across her feet, hips, knees, neck, even her head. Basically, Kayla felt like she was on fire 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Kayla had lost count of how many times she'd been to the emergency room, but no matter what the doctors tried, the pain never lessened. She could barely get out of bed, she'd had to quit her job, and now she was relying on her family to help her financially. Kayla had worked so hard for so long to build her life, and now it was all crumbling all around her, and it seemed like there was nothing anyone could do to help her. Even worse, really dark, depressing thoughts began to cloud her mind every day. All she wanted was for the pain to end, even if that meant falling asleep and never waking up again. But Kayla was determined to try to find some ray of hope in her life, and she knew she got a lot of comfort from her family. So she had decided to invite them all over for a Christmas celebration where she would prepare a meal for everyone. And as she struggled to clear some dishes from the counter, Kayla happened to notice what looked like a fresh burn on her forearm. She tried to remember how she did this, maybe she bumped into the stove or something and didn't notice, but she really had no memory of getting a burn. Thankfully, though, the burn was small and didn't get any worse, and so Kayla was able to successfully host her Christmas party. It was only a small get-together, but the visit really lifted Kayla's spirits. But on the morning of December 20th, so 4 days after that Christmas party where she noticed that burn on her arm, Kayla woke up to find that her forearm, from hand to elbow, was now completely covered with these small circular burns, just like the one she had noticed 4 days earlier. They looked like someone had stuck her with a white-hot poker, leaving behind bright red blisters. But obviously that wasn't happening. These burns were somehow forming from underneath her skin. Kayla was shocked, and she lifted her arm up to get a better look. When she flexed it at the elbow, the movement caused the burns to crack open and start to bleed. It hurt so much, Kayla couldn't even think. She immediately laid back down and kept her arm at her side to avoid causing any more damage. Horrible thoughts began to fill her mind as she lay there in bed that morning. Kayla imagined grabbing a sharp knife and just cutting her arm off to escape the pain. She kept thinking about the incredible relief that would bring her. But then she realized cutting her arm off would be pointless, because she knew from experience that these horrible pains she was experiencing would always eventually travel to the other parts of her body. Kayla gritted her teeth and then reached for her cell phone and called Dr. Scott. He was astonished by her alarming new symptoms. People with CRPS did sometimes develop burns like this, but Dr. Scott knew that was incredibly rare. In fact, it happens so infrequently within CRPS patients that nobody knew how to make it stop. So for now, the only advice Dr. Scott could give was for Kayla to get to the emergency room and hope the doctors there could do something to treat her burns. When Kayla hung up, she just started crying. She was in so much pain, she was so uncomfortable, and she knew that she was gonna go to the hospital because she was gonna do what she was told, but she knew they were not gonna be able to help her. No one could. Kayla was right. The doctors at the emergency room when she got there were totally baffled by her condition. The only burns like this they'd ever seen were from cancer patients going through radiation treatment. Whatever was doing this to Kayla was coming from inside her, and they just couldn't explain it. Kayla left the emergency room and headed home, still in total agony and feeling completely defeated. The days turned into months, the months turned into years, and at times Kayla's situation felt completely hopeless. Somehow, she always found the strength to keep going despite the unbelievable pain she was always in. By February of 2019, over 3 years after she crushed her hand, Kayla had gone to over 50 different doctors and had tried almost as many medical procedures, but nothing had worked. Finally, though, on what felt like her millionth trip to the hospital for the burns that covered her body, the doctors were at least honest with her. They knew they couldn't help her, and they told her that, but they could at least tell her what was ailing her. She didn't just have CRPS. She had the worst case of CRPS they'd ever seen, and perhaps one of the worst the world has ever seen. Most people who suffer from complex regional pain syndrome have symptoms in a single arm or leg. Unfortunately for Kayla, she suffered from symptoms across her entire body. In other words, she had a unique version of this very rare disorder. One doctor described it as stage 4, the most severe and painful form of CRPS. Kayla had long since learned why doctors sometimes call CRPS the suicide disease, but the doctor spelled it out in agonizing detail. The pain experienced by victims of CRPS can be worse than childbirth, broken bones, or even amputations. The suffering can get so intense that up to 40% of CRPS victims express a desire to want to kill themselves to get rid of the pain. Kayla winced at that last detail because she knew she fell into that 40%. She had had those dark thoughts. And in fact, lying in the hospital bed at that very moment, she couldn't help but think about dying and how really it would be so much easier to just die, because then she wouldn't feel the pain and she'd stop being a burden to her parents and family. Over the next few days, doctors and nurses streamed in and out of Kayla's room really just to see the patient with the extraordinary case of CRPS. Some even took pictures of her just for documentation. Kayla started to feel like she was not really a patient and more of an animal in a zoo exhibit. Then eventually, Kayla's doctors discharged her from the hospital after this latest flare-up subsided, but they were unable to offer any further relief from her crippling full-body pain. A short time after Kayla returned home after that millionth visit to the doctor, something remarkable happened. All of a sudden, for no clear reason, the pain just started to lessen. At first, Kayla hardly noticed, but by April of 2019, she felt noticeably better. By the end of the year, she was no longer covered in those burns and was feeling almost like her old self again. Finally, after almost 4 years of just pain and misery and torture, Kayla's nervous system had healed enough to properly transmit signals to her brain, which meant she was more or less back to her normal self. Although her CRPS will never be completely gone, Kayla was able to return to an active life. She went back to work at a restaurant, and she was recently honored with an award for excellence as a manager.